If you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you to turn to Mark chapter 8. We're in the series called Counting the Cost, where we are investigating what it means to live in meaningful discipleship. Discipleship is a word that you'll see and hear oftentimes thrown around in the church, but it's really important for us to digest and understand what it means. It's a substantial thing for one to commit themselves to a life of discipleship. And so that's why I've kind of entitled this series, A Journey into Meaningful Discipleship. This is our third week. In the first week, we talked about the subject of grace. And that grace, separated from committed discipleship, amounts to what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the author of the book that has inspired much of what we are talking about in this series. He wrote this book called The Cost of Discipleship. And we learned that grace without committed discipleship amounts to cheap grace, and it accomplishes nothing. That we make grace cheap when we refuse to be discipled, when we would prefer rather to take on a kind of religious persona or affiliation, but are unwilling to actually step into the waters of committed discipleship. And in doing that, we make what is priceless in the grace that God has dispensed to us, we make it cheap. We learned that meaningful discipleship is possible only by the gift of grace. That is, that the call to discipleship and living as a disciple is actually an impossible task for any of us to perform apart from the grace that God gives us to accomplish it. This grace is the gap where God does for us what we are unable to do for ourselves. So that was week one. Last week we talked about the call of Jesus to discipleship. And that the call of Jesus is not primarily a call to a set religion or institution, as we oftentimes tend to filter. We come into a religious setting like this, and we listen to the words of a person that maybe appears to be in charge of the institution, and we look around and we see members who are a part of the institution, and we start to come to understand the call as primarily a call to ourselves becoming a part of the institution, and what that institution may believe or hold as its values. But the call to discipleship is primarily, it's a call from Jesus himself to himself. That following Jesus means living in obedience, not primarily to the statutes and ordinances and beliefs and customs of an institution, even a church, but that first and foremost, and always as primary, following Jesus means living in obedience to Jesus. And so we started to scratch the surface a little bit about the significance of obedience. We learned that obedience to Jesus moves us to act in ways that can be unnatural for us. We talked about the reason why we do things. We do things because we enjoy doing them, right? And it requires very little sacrifice for us to do the things that we enjoy, and we feel a lot of reward for doing them. Or there are those things that we perhaps feel little reward for in the moment, and they require high degrees of sacrifice. And then there are the kinds of things that we do for the sake of virtue, right? Because we believe it's just simply the right thing to do, and sometimes we are willing to make a high sacrifice in exchange for the high reward of how doing that particular thing makes us feel. But that obedience is just like this other level kind of thing, because obedience, while it requires a high sacrifice on our part, it oftentimes yields, at least in the short term, what seems to be very, very little in the way of reward. And so we seek to follow Jesus by being obedient to Jesus. Today I want to talk about the choice that having understood something about the grace that God makes available to us in order for us to become disciples, understanding the fact that Jesus has now called us to become his disciples, we are left here at this point of choosing for ourselves whether we are going to actually follow Jesus. And when I talk about the choice, what I really mean to say is that there is a choice. There is always kind of this first act of obedience, this first step that we take, but that is then followed by a lifelong series of choices. We don't choose just once to follow Jesus, but in fact, the life of following Jesus requires an ongoing, constant, and daily surrender. So, Mark chapter 8, if you're there, I'm going to invite you to stand as we read God's word together this morning. Mark chapter 8, I want to read for you verses 31 through 38. Then Jesus began to teach them that it was necessary for the Son of Man. When you see Son of Man, this is Jesus using a title to describe himself. And he said, it was necessary for the Son of Man to suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes. So in other words, the religious leaders of the day were going to be responsible for being on the other side, the ones that would introduce the suffering that Jesus was going to experience, the ones who themselves were going to reject the role that Jesus played as Messiah and King. So he would be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, be killed, and rise after 3 days. He spoke openly about this. So as you're reading through the Gospels, a lot of times you'll find Jesus making some very faint or kind of mystical allusions to what he is headed toward. But here we are told by Mark that he's begun to speak openly about what is going to happen. And then Peter, who many of you know, one of the kind of primary of the 12 disciples. Peter sort of sits here at the top. And Peter took Jesus aside. Can you imagine? He took Jesus aside and he began to rebuke him. But turning around and looking at his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking about God's concerns, but human concerns." And isn't that a problem? When we begin to think more about human concerns than God's concerns. Calling the crowd along with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone wants to follow after me, let him or her deny himself, herself, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life because of me and the gospel will save it. For what does it benefit someone to gain the whole world and yet lose his life? What can anyone give in exchange for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Thank you. You may be seated. I want to talk about the choice through two lenses of our choosing. In our determining to be Jesus' disciples, there are these two arenas that I want to explore in which we commit ourselves to discipleship. The first one, as I said, we touched upon it last week, and I just want to elaborate more on it, is that choosing to follow means choosing obedience. Choosing to follow Jesus means choosing to be obedient to him. Now, the reason why Jesus issues this call, this invitation, whatever you want to call it, is because it provides us with the opportunity for a choice. That without this call, without this invitation, we are sort of left to ourselves without having a choice to make. But that when Jesus issues the call, we find ourselves sort of suddenly, and perhaps very abruptly, now left with a choice. How many of you ever found yourselves kind of stuck between a couple of different options, and you weren't exactly sure which way you ought to go, but you knew you had to choose? Like at some point, you could investigate until you felt like you had exhausted every single question, and that you had, to whatever degree it's possible, satisfied yourself, that you had all the information you could possibly need, and now is just simply time to make a choice. And for a lot of us, we have encountered the experience of finding ourselves face to face with Jesus. And it was time to choose. And in that moment of choosing, what we are choosing to do is either to obey Jesus or not to obey Jesus. That is what the choice ultimately comes down to. Now, like what we like to talk about is whether we are going to choose to have faith in Jesus or not. And so let me just ask this question. Does it take faith to choose to follow Jesus, or does faith follow obedience? This is $1 million question. This is a question we're not going to necessarily arrive at the answer of today. I recently listened to this podcast. It was a debate between an atheist and a Christian. And what they were debating was the subject of the hiddenness of God. There's this question, a conversation regarding the degree of hiddenness that God seems to allow for us as human beings to experience. In other words, what we don't experience in a normal sense is the very openness of God's presence and working around us. So, in other words, we don't see physically, tangibly, expressly God here in the sanctuary this morning, do we? And that is not the experience that we have as we go about living in this world, where from time to time we encounter in the flesh the person of God. And so this question of divine hiddenness really kind of amounts to, well, why is it, if God in fact loves us as human beings so much, like the preacher often says, if God does in fact want for every single one of us to be in a relationship with him, as religion is prone to teach us is the truth, then why does he spend so much time, from our point of view, behind the curtain? Like, why doesn't he, like in our vernacular we'd say, why doesn't God just write it up in the sky what he wants us to know or to see or to hear or to believe? Why doesn't he do that? Why doesn't he just come and speak to me audibly, unmistakably, in a way that I could not mistake for something else? Why does God not do that? Why does he, in fact, maintain some degree of hiddenness? And so this is what the debate was about. And so this atheist, like, he just could not get over the fact that a God who is supposed to be a God of infinite love, how he would even allow, how he would even permit the possibility that a human being not be given the absolute and unmistakable opportunity to see him and to choose him. And it was certainly a debate worth listening to, but what I found very interesting, and the reason why I bring it up, is because when given the opportunity, the Christian man on the other side of the table said to the atheist, said, so much of what I have heard you kind of express and experience has me thinking that you are only a step of obedience away from believing yourself. Like, that the problem is not that God has not revealed enough of himself to you. The problem really comes down to your unwillingness to obey Jesus. And of course, they went back and forth on the subject and ultimately never came to an agreement with one another. But I found it fascinating when this atheist admitted and said, I think that if I were to begin living like or acting like a Christian, in other words, if I started to take seriously whatever I imagined this alleged Jesus was asking me to do, that if I did that I might just fall into the trap of becoming a believer. It reminded me, growing up, how desperately my mother and my grandparents, how much they wanted me to eat vegetables. And they would prepare vegetables, and they'd put vegetables in front of me. And they'd say, eat your vegetables. Sometimes they'd make me sit at the table for, my mother would be upset if I said this, but I'm going to call it hours, right? Because when you're a little kid, it's hours until I ate my vegetables. And I think I actually preferred to think that I didn't like vegetables over opening myself up to the world of vegetables. Choosing to follow means choosing obedience. And if we're unwilling to take the first step of obedience, then we don't have the opportunity to actually learn how to have faith. And this is why when Jesus issues the call, what he is creating is an opportunity for us to choose. And that without that medium, without that venue, we'd have no opportunity to actually have faith. We love to throw the word faith around. We have cheapened even the very idea of what faith actually is when we just simply express certain notions like, well, I have faith in God. I believe in God. And yet, there's nothing really substantial behind those words that we're articulating. What kind of faith in those moments are we really talking about if it is completely unattached from any kind of action, i.e., obedience? Now, when it comes to faith and obedience, they're very difficult to put into order, right? Faith and obedience, I would propose, are so inseparable that you can't really determine the order of the chicken or the egg, as it were. Now, theologically, and many of you are sort of familiar and understand from a theological perspective, we talk first about faith, right? That we understand it is faith that justifies us before God. When I say justify, that's just sort of a fancy term for how we are put in a right standing with God. Like, how is that possible that we who are on the outs with God prior to being justified, how is it that we are made right with God? Well, the Bible teaches us that that is accomplished through faith, right? That the grace of God, God doing for us what we cannot do for ourselves, is received in faith, and that justifies us before God. And so when we talk about the beginning of the Christian life, right, we talk like if we were to treat the Christian life as a simple kind of, trajectory or journey from here to here, like in a linear sense, we talk about the beginning of the Christian life, we'll often point to the moment when a person puts their trust in God. And I say trust here because trust is just another word for faith. And like I said, faith just is an easy word. It just rolls off our tongue. But I think trust helps us to understand a little bit more the weight of what we're talking about. We put our trust in God. We entrust ourselves to God. That moment where we put our faith in God, our trust in God, it's defined by certain acknowledgments, like confession of sin. Right? We confess before God that we are sinners, that we have sinned against him, that we have rebelled against his ways. In that moment, we express a willingness to turn away from a life of sinful rebellion. That is, we're going to turn away from our sin, and we're going to turn our lives and our hearts toward God. That we are going to, again, by faith, we are going to receive the fullness of God's forgiveness, and that we are going to commit ourselves to making Jesus the Lord of our lives. Like, that's sort of the thing that we're talking about when we experience this moment of saving faith. Where faith is exercised, like how faith is utilized in this moment, is that it's something along the lines of, I acknowledge that I have a debt to pay, that I am indebted, again, that I am on the outs with God because of my sin. And that while I have a debt to pay, where faith comes in, faith holds that Jesus has paid that debt on my behalf. Does that make sense? So again, we're talking about how faith and obedience are difficult to put into order, right? So theologically, we talk about faith sort of preceding, and then maybe we'll talk about how once a person has exercised faith in Jesus and God does this miraculous, transformative work in a person's life, then good works spill over out of that life that now belongs to Jesus. And so we treat it as a kind of sequence. Now, this is different from another religious model where you may find that obedience is put first. So rather than faith being kind of the igniting force, if you will, there is a religious model that puts obedience first. Usually, obedience has more to do with conforming to a religious structure than pure obedience to Jesus alone. In other words, the context in which you find this sort of teaching espoused is that, well, if you're going to be a Christian, here are the expectations for what that means. Here's what that looks like. Here's how you're supposed to behave. Here's what you're supposed to do. Here's what you're supposed to stop doing, right? And all of that. Some of you maybe have experienced this kind of religious way of thinking. Unfortunately, this tends to be much more concerned with behavior modification. It's a lot more concerned with how we behave than it is the inner change of the heart that we know that God is far more preoccupied by. The worshiper is set on a track of unending works to earn God's favor and grace. Now, instead of exercising faith in, hey, I have a debt to pay, and I have faith that Jesus has paid this debt on my behalf. This instead, it takes faith and puts faith in oneself. It's me putting faith in myself instead of in Jesus, in acknowledging that, well, yeah, I have a debt to pay, but I'm going to pay it myself. So, we don't want that, right? That's an obedience that's divorced from faith. That puts kind of the onus on obedience, but it divorces that obedience from faith. We don't want that. Because what you have there is something that's more like a, kind of gun to your head kind of obedience, a compelling to be obedient, or obedience for the sake of conformity. There are some, unfortunately, who are willing to modify their behavior and their lives so that they can fit in with whatever the group has sort of set as the standards for living. So that's an obedience divorced from faith. But we don't want the other either, which is a faith that's divorced from obedience. Because, well, what kind of faith is that? Right? If we take a faith and we separate it from obedience, what kind of faith are we actually talking about? And as a practical matter, here's the big question, right? If we try to create the sequence where faith comes first and obedience follows afterwards, here's the logical question we have to ask. When does obedience need to start? When? Like a few moments later? A week or two down the road? Years later? Like, what does it mean for a person to express that they have put faith in Jesus as Savior and Lord, and yet are unwilling to walk in steps of obedience to Him? And we have very much been around the kind of notion that obedience is something that'll come. And we've been given this sort of false assurance that at some point in time, obedience will follow. And again, just like trying to speak very, very practically and honestly, I would just say when. We don't see this modeled in the Gospels, do we? When Jesus calls Peter, and he says, "Come and follow me," Peter does not respond to him, "Well, Jesus, that sounds really nice, and I believe you are the King, the Messiah, the Christ. And I believe in you, and I believe in what you're doing. But I'm going to stay here by my net." See, when Jesus afforded the opportunity for Peter to choose, the choice was obedience or disobedience. "Come and follow me," Jesus said. And there Peter was, face to face. There was no way to distract from the reality of what this question entailed. When Jesus encountered Matthew sitting there in the tax collector's booth and said, "Come and follow me," Matthew had a choice. We find at other times, like when the rich young man came to Jesus and said, "What good thing must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responded to him, "To sell all you have, give the money to the poor, and then come and follow me." What was the result of that encounter? Well, we know that man went away sorrowful. Why? Because while there seemed to be, or at least he supposed, that he had some kind of faith that really meant something, when it came to it, he was unwilling to obey. And so we got to avoid a faith that is divorced from obedience. Now, we have to acknowledge that at some point, simple obedience became difficult, right? But it wasn't always like this. Obedience used to be simple. God said to Adam and Eve in the garden, "You may eat of the fruit of any of the trees in the garden, but for this one." Simple. God provided them with a choice. But then what happened? As the story goes, the serpent, the deceiver, comes in and says, "Did God really say you can't eat the fruit of the trees of the garden? Did God really say that?" And then following the fall of mankind into rebelliousness and sin, we find ourselves in a position where obedience, instead of being simple, has become far more complicated. It's become far more difficult. Why? Well, because we've grown up now, haven't we? We've grown up. We are not the innocents who had no awareness of good and evil. We've grown up, and now we have a conscience. We have the ability to reflect. We have the ability to weigh the morality of one decision over another. We have certain tools in our toolbox, like the ability to justify whatever it is that we want to justify. For Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, obedience was spontaneous. It was childlike. But now, we've gained access to the world of the knowledge of good and evil. We have a conscience. We feel guilt and shame. We learned the tradecraft of justifying our own actions. And today, we disobey because we doubt. We disobey because we doubt. Today, like back then, except now it's us asking the question ourselves. Did God really say that? Did God really mean that? Does Jesus really mean that for today? For me? Even given the special situation that I find myself in? Do we not do that? Or we exercise our powers of conscience and self-justification. We ask ourselves, well, how much guilt can I live with and still feel like I'm all right? Or even, how can I quiet the guilt and the angst that I feel until I can't feel it anymore? See, this is all getting in the way of our simple, unabashed obedience to what Jesus is calling us to do. You'll find in the Gospels from time to time Jesus issuing a simple command. And those who were unwilling to obey the simple command, they asked questions. Yeah, but Jesus, what about, right? Like the guy that prior to the story of the Good Samaritan, right? That one that came tempting Jesus, asked the same question as the rich young man. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus kind of gives him an answer, and then he asks a follow-up question and a follow-up question to that. That's what we do. Did God really say that? Did God really mean that? I love Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He shares this example, and I couldn't think of a better one, so I'll just share his. But he says it's kind of like a child who's been told to go to bed, right? Like just issued this very clear directive from dad that says, go to bed. Imagine if the child hears the directive, go to bed. Simple obedience does what? That's right, class. It goes to bed, right? Like that's simple obedience. Imagine, though, instead of going to bed, the child begins to wrestle with what dad has said. Dad said, go to bed. What he means is that he thinks I'm tired. And he doesn't want me to be tired. And in order for me to not be tired, you know what I can do? I can go outside and play, and then I won't be tired anymore. And the child goes outside and plays. What has he done? He's done the very exact opposite of what obedience required, because he's justified it. How much are you and I sometimes willing to do the same, rather than just practice simple obedience? So Jesus invites us to simple, single-minded obedience, where we are free from being divided within ourselves. Right? Even now, some of us this morning, like, we are divided in ourselves because of our unwillingness to just simply obey. You don't need me to tell you what to do. You don't need the authority of a church or some other kind of sacred institution to tell you what to do. You are just like the rich young man that came to Jesus. Jesus, what must I do? And he was hoping to hear some good thing that would validate and affirm him. And you know what Jesus basically said to him? You know exactly what to do. You know exactly what to do. That's the situation I find myself facing. If you were honest, I think that's the situation that a lot of you find yourselves facing. And the question is, will we be obedient or will we not? I'm going to stop there. I wanted to talk about how choosing Jesus means choosing the cross. And perhaps we'll get to that next week. I'll figure that out. But I want to leave us there this morning. But I want to ask as we close our time together, what if you chose obedience to Jesus' call? I just want you to imagine, right? Like that thing that maybe you have justified, that thing that you have suppressed, that thing that you've tried to kind of, like, because you want to, you want to follow Jesus. Like you're there, you're moving in discipleship, but there's still, you recognize that there's a barrier, or there's some barriers that are in the way. Well, what if you chose, instead of trying to work around and to feel better about what it is that Jesus is asking you to do, what if you just chose to obey? What if you chose to let faith and obedience live in harmony with one another, not divorced from one another, but two peas in a pod, and let your faith be propelled and fueled by obedience right now? No more delay. No more putting it off. What would that mean? What would that look like if you chose to obey Jesus'